And now I'm going to turn it over to, I'm going to give a brief introduction to our two panelists for their comments, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Brad Breeding is the co-founder and president of My Life Site, and part of my typo is about a site that provides information to consumers about CCRCs across the country. And Jack Cumming is CCRC resident and advocate for financial solvency within this industry. So let me first ask Brad just to introduce himself. And actually, I don't know, Brad, if you want to even show your webcam, you don't have to. I see Jack has, but feel free to just give a few comments about yourself.
Well, I should thank Lynn for making this happen. I'm labeled here as Lynn somehow, but thank you, Lynn.
Well, I am not prepared to be on video today, so I'll just go with the audio. But thank you so much, AV. I thought that was a wonderful, for you to be able to take such a complex topic and to put it in terms that I think practically anybody could understand, especially me, which says a lot. Then you're doing a great service. So hopefully it's been a big help to everybody on the call today. Want to just thank you for your work. You know, we get questions all the time at our website, at My Life Site, about what to ask, what to look for. We've even got guides on our website about this kind of thing. And so the actuarial piece, in my opinion, is becoming a bigger and bigger component in terms of, I think, people's awareness of that. And so you're helping to further that awareness today with this webinar that you're doing. And certainly we're going to do all we can at My Life Site to make sure that, you know, that word is out there, that this is such an important component. But I do think also what you mentioned was important. I think there is sometimes people perhaps feel that an actuarial study is a foolproof measure. And as you said, it is a extremely important component, but certain market factors could change that. That would be out of your control, or certainly out of the reach of what a actuarial study could control. So I think that's important. And I don't know, I'm interested to hear some of the questions, so I'll kind of, I'll go ahead and let Jack speak. I'm sure that a lot of what I might bring up would be covered in some of the questions you'll get. So thank you again, and with that, I'll turn it over to Jack.
Okay, and AV disappeared here, so that's interesting. Can you all hear me?
Go ahead, I'm here. I'm just looking at questions, so I don't want to distract anyone. But yes, we can hear you, I think.
Okay. First, I want to note that I am an actuary, so this is something that's been of interest to me ever since I moved into a CCRC 12 years ago. And from listening to AV, it's evident that this is very complicated. There are many elements involved in running a senior housing enterprise, and particularly when you bring entrance fees into the picture, and that all that the actuarial report does is to provide an analytical tool which can help managements to better understand the kinds of risks that are embedded in the contracts that they're offering. So prudence becomes very critical in approaching anything as sensitive as the senior housing industry, where you're taking care of an aging population who can be vulnerable, etc. First, I just note two observations that occurred to me as I was listening to AV. One is, rules of thumb are not scientific business tools. So what the actuaries are doing is creating this very complicated model, more complicated than the accounting tools typically are, and that by having that complicated model, they're better able to hone in on the specifics of a particular enterprise. And if there are recurring actuarial studies, they can refine the assumptions over time to reflect the practicalities of the particular community. And that can be a very big help to management in ensuring that the community remains financially sound. The other is that for an enterprise that takes money in advance to provide benefits later, it's not appropriate to just use cash flow. Now, AV mentioned Social Security, but we all know that there are intergenerational inequities inherent in the way Social Security has been handled. and that becomes a problem when you're asking a smaller generation to pay for the retirement of a large generation like the baby boomers. So those are the thoughts that occurred to me as we looked at this thing. I particularly like the points that AV had on slide number 6, where he had 3 simple concepts. I don't know whether you can go back to that.
I have, Jack.
Yeah. So I just thought, are your reserves adequate to meet the obligations? And are the fees adequate? I mean, that's really what you're saying. Is the whole enterprise financially sound for today and for the future? And that's important when you're in a trust business. Those are my thoughts.
Well, thank you, Jack. I'm gonna bring my webcam back on, and folks, pardon me if my eyes seem to go back and forth because I'm trying to go through some of the questions that have been asked. And the first one, first is slide 14, addressed to me, and I'm thinking, or actually it's addressed to Brad and Jack, when I mentioned that cash is king is not sufficient. And if you always speak to this, and if not, they said, I see that CCRC balance sheets with net asset value to negative 6 figures, and the value is becoming more negative each year. So sort of the disconnect between accounting and possible actuarial standards. They don't necessarily show what the actuarial position may be at that time. It may be underfunded, it may be slightly funded, but maybe Jack and both Brad could talk about should one look beyond just cash in looking at financial solvency for a CCRC.
Well, yes. I mean, if accounting has any meaning, then a negative net asset position is not a desirable condition to be in. I think it's as simple as that. So if you say, well, a negative balance sheet is of no concern, then that's, if an accountant says that, that would be saying accountancy doesn't have any meaning, because accountancy is only valuable if it's reflecting the underlying economics of the enterprise. So if the enterprise is sound, it will generally have a positive balance. Now that's difficult for if you're using entrance fees as a financing vehicle. But if you, there are ways of using those entrance fees for financing, but keeping track of the liabilities that the entrance fees were paid to fund. That's the insurance model. And the industry has avoided that, going toward that insurance model, with the effect that now there are concerns about these negative net asset communities.
Brad, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Jack is probably can shed as much light on that as anyone that I'm aware of, and so I think his comments are really spot on. I guess my question, and I'll turn this back to Jack, would be, Jack, if there are those on the call, sounds like the person whoever entered the question perhaps is in a community that has that situation currently. You know, what do you feel like? I guess my point is, without scaring people, you know, what kind of situation they're in. What is the sort of anecdote, and what might be the outlook for a community that is in that situation if we don't, and maybe we don't know if they're in satisfactory actuarial balance or not? What would you recommend, Jack, from there, if somebody finds that to be the case in their community?
Well, it would certainly be concerning. There are, most of these communities do not go all the way to insolvency. Insolvency occurs. The investors here are the debt providers. So if you get to the point where you can't meet your debt covenants and you can't cover the debt, now you're in real trouble. That means you burned through all the cash that came from the entrance fees. So that certainly is concerning. But you know, there's no. I think the important thing for residents to understand that is, unlike the situation with banking, insurance, and brokerage firms, there are no guarantee fund programs for this industry. So if it does go toward receivership at the state level or bankruptcy at the federal level, generally the deficiencies are going to have to be made up by future fees or in some other way. In general, residents have not been asked to move out of their communities. And it may be that you got a bargain because you were underpaying for what you had up to the time of the insufficiency. But in the future, it will have to be made up, and all the money eventually has to come from the residents. So residents need to be heavily involved in these financial considerations, unless the industry were to step up and put in place those protective mechanisms as they exist for insurance, banking, and securities.
Let me just add one thing and try to put this in context, not to alert folks. I guess the one thing I would say is that if a community has negative net assets and there are no actuarial studies being done, that is the appropriate time to ask the board of management to do an actuarial study. And this is not a self-serving comment. In my presentation, I tried to stress, and one thing I should say, one value of the FSO is that when you do an FSO, you've done most of the work you need to do an actuarial study. The gap statements were designed for products where the revenues that came in during an accounting period were designed and offset by the expenses that came in during the accounting period. It was not designed for a product where there's a prepayment of revenues. So you're using a tool to measure solvency that can't do it. And for 30 years, we've been talking about, between the accounting and the actuarial professions, trying to design financial statements that converge for CCRCs. That hasn't happened. It came somewhat close in the latest round when they were revising ASC 606 and doing worldwide convergence on accounting statements. But it didn't happen then. They decided to continue, give folks the option to do what they've been doing, or a new option. So it's not going to happen in the future. The actuarial study will tell you whether or not this site is insolvent. And there are a lot of things in accounting that can create negative net assets and how they treat bond financing, et cetera, and early refunds that may not necessarily mean a financial insolvency. So the actuarial study will tell you that, generally speaking, there is a matching between an underfunded status and negative net assets, but that's not always the case. But an actuarial study will tell you where you stand with your current residents, which of your contracts you sell to new entrants are adequate or not, and then you can develop a plan if it is a material imbalance to correct it over time. But that is the appropriate time. So just because you have negative net assets doesn't mean that you are actuarially insolvent or not in satisfactory actuarial amounts, but you need to use that tool to figure that out. And it's really more about, let's get the information out there. And again, even if you are underfunded right now, as long as management has a plan to be fully funded, is good. The danger is that if you never look at or quantify where you really are, then you may have a tendency to not adjust fees as you should, and therefore make things even worse. And the one other point I just want to make is that one of the things about the debt covenants and the bond finance industry, that again, they're using a tool that's not designed for CCRCs. And I'll divert by that. Though, when I was in college, I used to do an internship in the early 70s at an insurance company. And one of the first tasks I had to do was develop an asset share model, which was a model that basically says for a block of insurance policies, whether or not they would be profitable over their lifetime. Well, that's actually what we do with CCRC actuarial studies. And my point is that in terms of, if a community is insolvent right now, it can be improved over time. And the bond covenants of, you can have a bond covenant of 1.2 times debt service annually, but you can have 50% cash to debt. And if, because your turnover was low in 1 year, you don't meet the bond covenant, it rings red flags, whereas you got enough cash to pay your debt service for the next 10 years. Those types of rules have not been changed or adapted to fit the CCRC contractual model, and it's unlikely that they ever will be done. It's been that way for 40 years. So what's happening is that you're using a set of tools that are really not appropriate for a CCRC, and that's really the value of looking at your actuarial study to say, here's where we really are.
AV, could you say a word about this concern that about your concern about the continuing care model, that may move more toward a rental, or what is exactly your concern in that area?
All right. Good question, Jack. And I have one other question I want to bring as well. My concern in that is that, and it goes really to the bond financing and how it's done. Because there's concern, well, entry fee receipts are variable. We don't want to count on that too much for meeting our bond covenants because we're focused on cash and we're not going to accept any other measure for solvency. There's a pushback in a sense to say, let's get more and more products that are less entry fee based or have monthly fees go up to match costs. So therefore we minimize our risk as provider and bondholders. Well, my experience has been that the type A CCRC contract is a well-working managed care, long-term care insurance policy. And so if we allow the continued push for financing and focus on cash is king, as opposed to measuring solvency by doing the ASOP number 3 test, it's going to eventually come to a point where maybe no CCRC can effectively offer a type A contract because they won't be able to meet their financing requirements. And that would be unfortunate, that a beautiful product such as this that helps meet the financial security needs for many of our forthcoming baby boomers who studies show haven't saved as much as our parents, that we won't be able to buy this sort of long-term care policy and its benefits and preserve our income and assets, as well as not worry about running out of money. So it's possible. I mean, the trend is heading that way. Fortunately, and I've been in the industry for 40 years, for the day one when I joined this industry, there was always lament that type A contracts were dinosaurs and they were going to be extinct in a few years. So far, there's still about 50% of the industry, I believe, in terms of total contracts sold. So it's still hanging in there. But again, if a lack of understanding of how this product works leads us to a belief that a type B or a type C contract is safer, that would be unfortunate and really doesn't fit with the facts. One other question I'd like to ask you is that someone mentioned that they have an actual study done triennially for state requirements by a national firm. They feel that some of the assumptions are optimistic compared to historical performance, occupancy, etc. Does an actuarial firm have any ethical obligations to ensure assumptions are realistic based on either past performance or corrective actions identified by the provider to support non-historical assumptions? Or in the case of my location, can the actuary simply say the findings are based on the assumptions furnished? If the latter, then the study is essentially useless, they say, because it's not supported by historical assumptions. A good question. Part of the actuarial opinion, I didn't focus on that, should say, and it's in the standards, the actuary thinks the assumptions are reasonable. So when you're hired by a client and they provide assumptions, and the key issue is that how quickly they will fill up. There are other assumptions as well, but it's really the fill up assumptions, or if they're low oxygen, will they be increasing? Does the actuary continually accept that if the container community is at 70% oxy and they say they're going to get to 90% in the next 5 years, and they do that year after year after year, does the actuary have an ethical or professional obligation to not use those assumptions? I would say there's probably a professional obligation after the first year where the community has missed their growth assumptions to refine those and maybe not grow them as quickly as they were expecting, so to speak. We have our own internal standards on that, and even if a client might insist on a second or third year to have increasing oxygen assumptions that are more rapid than what's being experienced, we will often include in the report a projection that shows what if oxygen stays constant, and that's embedded in the report. So the baseline assumption may be this increase, but the alternative is in the report, and the actuarial opinion should be written where it expresses that kind of concern, or there should be a caveat section, et cetera. So if again, it's all about context. These things should be laid out, and that's why when we're talking about actuarial reports, you really should see the whole report, because if you don't know all the assumptions involved, it's easy to be misled. Jack, did you want to add something to that?
Well, this is the same independence challenge that the accountants have, because they're paid by the clients and they want to please the client, and the clients don't always have the same level of integrity as the professional might bring to the thing. And so the question is, where does the obligation of the professional take them? If the client is asking you to do something that is inappropriate to do you have to resign the account or whatever? In the insurance industry, that resulted in having a regulatory standard. So insurance companies, they can use GAAP for their investors, but they are required to meet a statutory accounting standard that is developed by regulators, and the regulators are deemed to be fully independent of the clients and to have the public interest at heart. So I think that that's a question. If the industry is going to continue to have a very low level of regulation as it does now for these financial and contract matters, then it will have to meet a very high integrity standard and be able to demonstrate that it's meeting that standard. And I think that could become a challenge for this industry if it were to become a bigger part of housing for the elderly.
Good response, Jack. Next question. Is it totally optional of management to share actuarial reports with residents, or does management need your permission? I can't speak for all actuarial firms, but for our firm, we just ask management to inform us, and rarely do we deny sharing the entire actuarial report with them. Now, mind you, there are two kinds of reports we do. There's an annual report that's a summarized version, and in that case, we'd rather management give them a summary that we help them edit. But if it's the full report with the 100 pages, sharing that whole report is generally fine with us. We just ask management to let us know. It's a tricky question, but generally speaking, it's management's discretion in that regard. But the key is just to convey an appropriate assessment of where the community is right now, with the caveats and understanding that this can change over time. There are lots of assumptions. There are issues there that are important, and also be aware not to create alarm for clients. For example, in my anecdote where I told about a community start out that was 90% funded, no residents were asked to see the report back then, but the question is, when you're on a plan to improve and get to 100% funded, do you have to share the report at that time? It's a judgment call in each case, but we're generally supportive of sharing information appropriately with residents. And I have done literally hundreds of presentations on our actuarial studies to client resident groups where I was invited specifically by the board and management. So I think that it's not uncommon for them to do so. These are very complicated matters and require explanation. Another question is, our state association has struggled in Maryland to get legislation to require actuarial studies every 3 years for Type C communities. The providers oppose because of the cost, and it's only a snapshot. Is there a better strategy since you say voluntary is better? Well, we have clients who have said to me they've drunk the actuarial Kool-Aid. They're not in a regulated state. They do actuarial studies on an annual basis and use that information to set their pricing and fees. Jack and I have actually talked about this. My strategy, I think, is really, to educate residents of CCRCs on the value of actuarial studies and protecting their interests and making sure that their community is solvent, or help to make sure, to provide information to help the decision makers make decisions that will lead to the long-term solvency of the community, as well as with prospects, people interested in the community, to say, if you don't have an actuarial study, why should I trust your judgment so low on whether or not your community is sound? And that's one of the reasons why we invited Brad as a panelist, because his site provides comparative information for CCRC prospects to look at. And again, whether or not they have actuarial studies might be a question that a prospective resident could ask, and also might be something that one could include in their profile, so to speak. And I'm seeing a new question here. How do communities that haven't done actuarial studies set pricing? And what is the importance of actuarial studies for Type C contracts? Let me do the Type C, and that's also the one in Maryland that they're arguing, well, this is fee for service. We got an upfront fee. We don't need an actuarial study. It's only healthcare. That is just simply not true. What gives rise to actuarial studies is the pre-funding of any cost. And that pre-funding is manifested in the fact that they are charging an upfront entry fee. Doesn't matter whether it's A, B, or C. That upfront entry fee is somewhat like an annuity in terms of how it should be used, but basically that's where the pre-funding comes in. And I've never seen a Type C contract charge an upfront entry plus monthly rental fees that covered all their costs. The marketplace just doesn't buy into a product with that big of a surplus. So my point is, if you're charging an upfront entry fee, and yes, we got to get a definition of what constitutes an upfront entry fee, but let's say it's at least 12 times the monthly fee, then it gives rise to pre-funding, which gives rise to the benefit of using actuarial analysis to determine your solvency, because you now have revenues that are to be used over the lifetime of a resident. What about communities that haven't done actuarial studies set pricing? I think they look at what the market will bear. They look at what their competitors are charging. I don't know if they always look at, are we offering similar products, but it's somewhat guesswork. I did my first actuarial study in 1979. Back then, I think that community was brand new. They felt that their management team had done a good job. They hired a Wharton School professor to do an actuarial study because they wanted reassurance. And if memory serves me correctly, they may have been slightly underfunded, but not too far. There were minor adjustments. I think most of the time the fees are not draconian increases. And the fact that our median funded status is over 100% tells me that actuarial pricing is sound, so it's doable. It's just a question of, do you want to make your decisions with limited knowledge and hope that they're right, or is it in your fiduciary responsibility to use all of the knowledge at your fingertips to make this decision? Notwithstanding, actuarial studies are not free. So who can place a value on how much you're willing to pay for an actuarial analysis now? That really depends on the current board and management. I was not joking when I said the cost for our clients on average who do a study annually is less than 1/10 of 1% of their operating budget. That's still not, it's still cash dollars when you look at it, but the question is the value of getting this information sufficient to avoid mistakes or not? I think it's immaterial, but everyone has their own opinion on that regard, and I think I'm fortunate that the clients that we and other actuaries work with, which I think is about 30% of the industry, feel that it is worthwhile doing that.
Well, AV, I'd like to make one quick comment on that too before you move on to your question. For those on the call, I really think that in terms of budget for that type of an expense, if that really was an issue, I almost look to sales. I think that this is also, I think there's a bigger connection. If anybody read our post this morning, I think there's a bigger connection between this topic and sales than some, particularly management, stops to realize, because I think it's evident from the number of people on this call that this is what, prospective residents clearly want peace of mind about the financial soundness, and actuarial reports play a big role in that, and as you've discussed today. And so I think it should be as much of an expense that might be covered by some aspect of sales as much as any other part of the budget, because at the end of the day, I really think that this would help drive sales.
Good comment, Brad. Good comment. Another question we have here is that, let me read it. In the CCRC parlance, how important are annual population actuarial studies as we experience more aging in place on the impacts of level of care and assumptions for media SAB? I think that it is one. These actuarial studies are a snapshot in time, so if you can afford it, doing them annually is the best way. It should be part of your budgeting and pricing process each year. If not, doing them every 3 to 5 years is sufficient. But never doing a study and just assuming that you are sound and relying totally on gap statements or ratio analysis, I don't think it gives you sufficient information to make solvency decisions and to be able to say to residents, we have sufficient cash to meet your future needs based on a reasonable set of assumptions. Oh, here's a good question. Why won't my manager show me a resident the complete actuarial report? There are lots of, an actuarial report, as I said, is over 100 pages. There are lots of assumptions that are involved with it. There's some decisions about those assumptions that the board, management, and actuary think are reasonable. If you share that full report, and I know some clients that do and some that don't, then you also invite the residents to start challenging those assumptions. That's their right to do so, but at the end of the day, the board and management and actuary have to agree upon a set of assumptions they think are reasonable and reflective of the future. So sometimes it may be appropriate to say, rather than get bogged down in the debate over what the assumptions are, we've got a reasonable set and we're going to update every year, so that's sufficient. Another item is that when you're looking at the pricing of different contracts, not all contracts may have the same actuarial margin, and some contracts may be more favorable than others, either by accident or by design. That may or may not be something that the board or management want to get into discussion on right now. They may say, or even more in particular, when it comes by unit type. It turns out in virtually every facility, because most of the costs are wages and per person based, the pricing structure is favored toward the smaller units. In other words, they end up being at an actuarial deficit, whereas the large units end up being an actuarial margin. One could argue that, well, wait a minute, we do this on cost, the smaller units should be pricing more and the large units less. But we know from a sales viewpoint, people value larger units more and are more willing to pay the fees. And if you started raising those smaller units to be their covered actuarial costs, you wouldn't sell any. So there's certain judgment calls on how you socialize costs that are involved in an actuarial study and analysis. So I'm speculating here that sometimes to avoid a sort of conversation that really there's no right answer to. I know sometimes folks ask us, well, what should be the right second person entry fee? Some communities charge none, some charge that person entry fee. When I first started out, I thought I had the answer, and over the years I learned there is no right answer to that. It's just a judgment call on what you think is appropriate. So long answer to your question is they may have reasons which they haven't expressed why they choose not to share the report, but the fact they're doing actuarial studies is a positive thing. Question, how do we get our CCRC board to do an actuarial study and share at least a summary of the study? Good question. I don't know if I have an answer for that one, other than say, because ultimately as prospects and residents learn more about the value of actuarial studies and it being a tool and also in conjunction with assumptions, it should become a standard for any well-meaning CCRC board to engage in this behavior. We're selling you a lifetime contract. We want to make sure to the best of our ability that we're pricing this correctly and accumulating reserves appropriately and not overcharging you. Actuarial studies don't mean that necessarily that you have to be charged more. It may be that fees can be less, so we have adequate surplus, so therefore we can raise fees at a lower level. I think just educating the board and management about this and asking them why not, and asking them questions. Well, how much cash should we have? How much reserves should we have? Can you quantify that for me? Really ask them to show how they quantify it, and then if they can't quantify that, possibly they might begin to say that this may make sense, and then they'll probably come back and say, well, it's costly. In that case, the residents should be able to say, we understand there's a cost to it, but it's part of our monthly fees, and we feel comfortable with the value of that cost in relation to what our monthly fees are. But it's a dialogue. Next question here. Any suggestions to motivate blank or other large providers provide periodic studies and make results available to resident representatives under appropriate confidentiality and judgment guidelines? Well, it really ties on to this other question. I don't know how to get them to do that. They should. I think this residents, as more and more residents and prospects become aware and ratified behind liability management is important, because you're selling me lifetime contracts, and we want to make sure those liabilities are measured and funded. They may get the message if they're resistant to it now. I know a lot of our clients are multi-sites and have gotten the message and share with their residents, either have us come out and speak or involved in the pricing center. So it's not unheard of for CCRCs to do this type of thing. There really should be nothing to be afraid of. I mean, again, as I've said, you don't have to be fully funded now. So about that liability management, that I want to know where we stand and that you're making plans to improve it or at least not go backwards. I had a client in Virginia, a different client in Virginia, who was fully funded, wanted to do a major expansion. The actuarial study showed as they did this expansion and they were filling up again, their actuarial status would become underfunded. And then, but in whatever number period we chose, they would be fully funded again. And the board adopted, said, this is our plan. So now when they got their actuarial study updates in the second year of expansion, they could say to residents, yes, it was expected that we would not be fully funded now, but we're moving in the right direction. There's just a lot of positives in terms of communication with residents, in my experience, about actuarial studies. But again, that's just, I'm probably just an anomaly in that particular issue.
AB, I'll add one quick thing while you're looking at your next question there about that. You mentioned a phrase earlier in the call, fiduciary responsibility, and hopefully those who are serving on the boards of various communities understand that they do have that responsibility, but they may not fully understand what is involved in that responsibility. So I think if you can help the board connect the dots between their fiduciary responsibility and the value of actuarial reports, then that might help motivate them.
Good point, Brad. Exactly. And when I've talked with board members, I always had a positive experience that they want to do the right thing. This is a complicated kind of contract, and they want to help to figure out doing the right kind of thing with that, and that would resonate with them. You have something, Jack, you want to add?
Well, I was just going to say, if Catherine Pearson were on the call sheet, the word fiduciary always triggers something. The board has a fiduciary responsibility to the enterprise to ensure the solvency of the enterprise. So that's important. But in terms of a fiduciary responsibility to the residents, some states, particularly California, for example, where I'm familiar with it, they've enacted a statute that say that the providers have no fiduciary responsibility to the residents. That's something that residents might want to be aware of in thinking about this, because it is a trust undertaking. And I think that, again, is something that the industry would be wise to address in a constructive way.
Good point, Jack. Our next question is, it sounds like as a resident, we should be pushing our boards and management to do actuarial studies if we have negative net assets. What are your thoughts? I think you should push them to do actuarial studies regardless of your gap position, but certainly that is a motivating factor that explain to me, if we got a negative net asset, which one would normally think sign of insolvency, why we should not be concerned as residents. And an actuarial study could come in and possibly show maybe that negative asset is a function of an accounting convention as opposed to a true insolvency. So yes, that's something as a tool to maybe get their attention in looking at that. Next question, is the dashboard only done for ASOP and not for actuarial compilation reports? We do them for both, actually. It came out of the summary actuarial compilations, but we include them in our full comprehensive studies. And it's just a way of just showing, comparing the past 2 years for a client. And often when we do board presentations, we may show a chart for the past 10 or 10 years of the funded status for a client. But anyone who's doing regular studies, they can see where they stand. Next question, and we have about 10 more minutes. If the CCRC decides to expand by borrowing an amount that is 50% more than the current debt, would it mean the actuarial balance before the debt be changed or to unbalance? Not necessarily. Actually, on an actuarial balance sheet, if you borrow money and say you borrowed $50 million, that's $50 million in cash, that did not change the actuarial surplus to deficit. Now, as you begin to do your expansion and as you're filling up and you have some startup losses as the facility's expansion is filling up, there may be a hit. But just the fact of borrowing money does not change your actuarial status. A little bit more complicated than that, but that is an overview. Borrowing money, that's cash on the liability side and the same cash on the asset side and the same debt on the liability side, so they're a wash in that regard. Let's see. All right. If a CCRC is legally attached to a large public nursing home, is actuarial study for both together called for or just the CCRC piece? It can be done either way. If when the resident transfers to the nursing home, if they're just charged a per diem rate, then that could be factored into the comprehensive actuarial study for the ILU assisted living component, and then the charges for the nursing are just on a per diem basis. Alternatively, one could encapsulate that nursing home in there and decide whether or not to include any gains or losses associated with the nursing home operations as part of the CCRC's of actuarial study. It can be done either way. It just depends on the particular situation that we're looking at, what you're trying to answer. Explain type A and contract and others. Very simply put, a type A contract characterization is sort of a legacy contract where residents pay essentially the same monthly fee as they transition through the various levels of care in their facility, be it independent living, be it independent with aging in place and getting some health care, home health support, be it transitioning to assisted living or nursing care unit or onto the dementia unit or vice versa. So in other words, the residents essentially pay the same fee further out there through entire lifetime in addition to the entry fee. A type B might be some bump up in fees as they go from independent living to, they may provide home care at no cost, but then when they go to assisted living or dementia, they may pay 80% of those costs. And nursing care may be 90% of those costs. There's an infinite variety of those type Bs, but basically it's a bump up from what they were paying before. And then type C is a so-called fee for service where actually they're supposed to pay the per diem rate, so they might get 15 days a year free, but not in many cases they may not be paying the full cost for assisted living, dementia, or nursing care. Those are B and C are sort of fine gradations, and they're not really precisely defined, but they're pretty much anything different from where a resident is paying essentially the same fee they paid in ILU when they transition over. And obviously there's some variations in type A where it may be they pay the average one bedroom fee when they get into assisted living nursing, but they're just general categorizations for the different kinds of monthly fee terms. Do you foresee the day when fees, entry and monthly, will be determined individually on an actuarial basis? In other words, someone entering at age 71 would pay a different fee for someone coming in at age 84. Well, actually, this happened about 20 years ago for a client of ours in California where they had entry fee pricing based on the age of the resident, and also they went one stage further. They did their pricing instead of allocating costs on a square footage basis. They assigned all of their units an ambiance factor between 1 and 4. So say a 2-bedroom unit with a nice view to such and such street may have an ambiance factor of 2.5, whereas an interior view 2-bedroom unit might be 2. So they went very progressive in how they allocated their costs and the pricing. And at the time, there was a thought that maybe this wouldn't be acceptable. They maintained full occupancy, and actually, it was something that was generated internally by the residents working with the board. But that's the only exception I know of nationally where it's been done. I'm not a marketing expert, but the theory is, I've heard, is that let's keep the pricing structure simple so we will socialize it across all ages. And this goes back to a question about what is the right first and second person fee for entry fees. These arguments are really endless. It's a question of, do you have a well-structured fee structure, fee concept, and you may weight it across different dimensions, and as long as the marketplace accepts that, that's fine. But it's a personal preference in terms of there is really no one right answer for that. Okay. Has your firm ever been hired by the residents to do an actuarial study if management is not willing to do one? No, we have not, but it's always the first time to do anything. All right. Do you take into account that a life care community may be an equalized pricing CCRC versus the more classic type A? If I understand your question, the actuarial formula applies whatever your contract terms are and the assumptions about operations and capital expenditures, regardless of the particular contract terms. So the actuarial methodology can be applied to all these contracts, and it also can be applied for both nonprofit and for-profit entities, even with estimating what the tax liabilities may be, or even partner distribution. So this formula it's a mathematical formula. It works as long as we know what your contract provisions are and can get access to the appropriate fees. Okay. If the management uses up entry fee for current expenses in 10 years, but the resident's life expectancy is 50 years, is this unsound? Probably. I mean, we'd have to be a little bit more specific, but I mean, if you're saying they run out of cash, then yes. How one uses the money and how much cash is left, I mean, we'd have to really evaluate that, but let me put it this way. Entry fee-based CCRCs should generally be having increasing cash and investment balances over time. Because what you're doing is you're starting with, here's our liability. Let's say its startup is $100 million and monthly fees cover $70 million. If 10 years down the road, inflation has doubled those liabilities to 200 million, and monthly fees are 140 million, keeping the balance, then your reserves should be 60 million. So your reserves went from 30 million to 60 million. And reserves are your cash and investments net of debt, so those balances should be increasing over time. Did you want to say something, Jack?
Yes, a common thing I hear is people say that Social Security is having a challenge because people are living longer and longer. And I want to comment on this question of longevity, because that was implicit in the question. Actuaries are very good at projecting improvements in mortality, and we do that. So if somebody lives to be 150, which would be unlikely, there would be some, the actuaries would make provision for that. Maybe 150 is too extreme, but we certainly now run our mortality tables out to age 120. And so I don't think people need to be concerned about that. We also forecast improvements in mortality due to the improvements in the healthcare industry. So that's all taken into account and need not be a concern.
But thank you, Jack. And I'm going to add one thing that as we close out the question, there's several I didn't get to. I'm assuming that the system will allow me to save these questions. I'll try to answer them in writing and send them to NaCCRA. In regard to this, what if people live longer than what you're expected? I've done some mathematical tests, and let's just say, for example, in today's assumptions, the state actual assumption, 20% of a resident's lifetime will be spent in a higher cost center, assisted living, memory care, nursing care. The fact that someone will longer, I don't think that folks are going to be likely to be living longer, and that percentage of being disabled is going to be increased. And our tests show that when people live longer, actually their pricing will be more solvent because they have a longer period of time to build up those reserves while they're independent. But the risk, what does increase is that the likelihood that someone will run out of money. So it becomes more important as we expect people to live longer to add this financial aid or benevolence liability to the actuarial analysis, which is often not included in the same actuarial study, but could be. I'm sorry I'm not able to get to all of the questions, but my voice is getting a little bit hoarse, and I see several of them still left. So I'm going to try to make sure they don't get lost here. But we're going to go ahead and stop the recording now and stop the session. Thanks everyone for participating, and look for to go to the NaCCRA website to get more information. Have a great day. Thank you.